There can be only one. When you hear that phrase, the thing that almost certainly pops into your head is Highlander. Its lingering impact on pop culture is particularly impressive considering the original 1986 film was actually a massive flop. Yes, the first Highlander movie was decapitated at the box office and seemed destined to fall into obscurity. But just like the immortals of the film, it would go on to live a long and healthy life. Of course, Highlander itself had its own share of casting challenges and production pitfalls. Sharpen your sword and find out what the f*** happened to this movie. Writer Gregory Widen was on a UK vacation and happened upon a suit of armor in the Tower of London, and he began to wonder about the man who had originally worn it. What would he think of the modern world? How many stories would he have if he was somehow still alive today? The wheels began turning in his head. Widen was still a student in the UCLA screenwriting program, and for a class assignment, he decided to write this story under the name Shadow Clan. When his instructor read the script, he advised Widen to send it to Hollywood agents, and it rapidly sold for a healthy sum. Widen later joked of the class project, "I got an A- and a house." Producers Peter Davis and Bill Panzer were captivated by the concept, but thought the script needed work. Widen's original darker version was inspired by Ridley Scott's The Duelists and was much more bleak, with brooding immortal combatants described as walking corpses living only to slaughter each other in an insane quest. Panzer Davis hired writers Peter Bellwood and Larry Ferguson to lighten the tone. The broad strokes of Widen's initial story remained: protagonist Connor MacLeod and his mentor Ramirez, a prolonged contest of immortals beheading each other to become the last remaining, and a present-day New York setting, interspersed with fascinating flashbacks of MacLeod's lengthy life. Bellwood and Ferguson's contributions would include the quickening's flashy transfer of power after a head leaves its neck, and the idea that immortals could not procreate, unlike Widen's MacLeod, who had fathered dozens of mortal children across his lifespan. Connor's first wife, Heather, was also added for extra emotional weight. The primary villain, known as the Knight, became the savage Kurgan, transformed from a tortured and weary adversary into a gleefully brutal psychopath. With a satisfactory script and a financier on board, the producers then searched for a director. They had been impressed with the music video work of Russell Mulcahy, along with his 1984 Australian horror movie Razorback. With Mulcahy hired, it was then time to find their Connor MacLeod, and they had hoped to get Mark Singer, the Beastmaster himself, and star of hit alien invasion show V. Singer had to decline due to scheduling conflicts, although he would eventually make an appearance on Highlander the series. The call then went out to just about everyone working at the time, including Michael Douglas, David Keith, Kevin Costner, Barry Bostwick, Mickey Rourke, Peter Weller, Mel Gibson, and the Police frontman Sting, who would have also been the main push behind the soundtrack. The movie finally seemed to find its Connor in genre favorite actor Kurt Russell, who liked the script and became attached to the project. Attention then turned to the female lead, the modern-day character of forensic scientist Brenda. Despite casting a wide net, most actresses declined. The movie finally landed Catherine Mary Stewart of The Last Starfighter and Night of the Comet. For MacLeod's eternal enemy, the imposing Kurgan, the filmmakers wanted someone that could seem frightening on screen. Earlier in the process, Scott Glenn and Roy Scheider had been potential candidates for the role, but the character had then changed from a smart killer to more of a hulking barbarian, and a different, significantly larger kind of actor was needed. After his turn as the relentless T-800 in The Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger was believed to be a perfect fit, but the Austrian Oak was not interested in another villain role at that time. Mulcahy had spoken to Sting, who had his own recommendation for the Kurgan. The singer had recently made the 1985 movie The Bride, and suggested Clancy Brown, who played Frankenstein's monster in the film. Mulcahy sent out the offer, but perhaps surprisingly, Brown wasn't sure he wanted the role. The actor had to wear a lot of face prosthetics for The Bride, and experienced an allergic reaction to the glue, so severe that production had to shut down for 3 weeks while he healed. But since his makeup for Highlander would supposedly not be quite as involved, he decided to take the part, despite a minimal paycheck. For the role of swashbuckling Spanish swordsman Juan Sanchez Villalobos Ramirez, the producers had wanted a big-name older actor like Clint Eastwood, Gene Hackman, Michael Caine, and Peter O'Toole, who all turned it down. According to Clancy Brown, at one point the MacLeod role had been offered to actual Scotsman Sean Connery, who instead suggested he would rather play Ramirez. They ultimately took him up on the idea, and Connery himself would earn $1 million for just 7 days of work, squeezing Highlander into his busy schedule just before starting on The Untouchables. But even as the production was looking for a shooting date, it started losing cast members. Catherine Mary Stewart would exit the film for unknown reasons, and although she was quickly replaced by Roxanne Hart, Kurt Russell had also departed, allegedly on the advice of his partner Goldie Hawn. Instead, Russell went off to make Big Trouble in Little China with his friend John Carpenter, unwittingly going from one flop-turned-cult favorite to another. During the desperate search for a Connor MacLeod, Mulcahy was flipping through a magazine and saw an image of Christopher Lambert from his recently released movie Greystoke, The Legend of Tarzan, Lord of the Apes. Mulcahy thought he had the perfect look for MacLeod, and Lambert was offered the part and quickly accepted. Unfortunately for the filmmakers, they were shocked to discover that the French actor named Christophe Guy Denis Lambert couldn't actually speak any English. Lambert was swiftly assigned an English teacher and dialect coach, and Mulcahy was happy to learn the actor picked up the language without much issue. Lambert and the dialect coach decided that Connor should have a muddled accent that didn't reference any specific region, figuring a man who lived for centuries would have moved all over the world at different points. Shooting on Highlander began in April 1985 with the hopes that all the problems were in the past, which would not be the case. Weather seemed to be the biggest enemy for much of the ambitious production. During the scene where Connor and the Kurgan meet, it rained so hard the crew had to use umbrellas and hairdryers to protect the cameras and lenses. The movie's bloody battle scenes were filmed in Scotland during freezing rain and even snow, despite the springtime shoot. Mulcahy was impressed with the local Scottish extras, who he said mostly just wanted a bottle of scotch at the end of the day. The extras playing the kilted warriors would reportedly drink half the night, sleep outside, and then show up early the next morning. And after a liquid lunch at the local pub, many would be overly enthusiastic during battle scenes, leading to a whole lot of injuries to keep the medical staff busy. Lambert's limitations also didn't help, as in addition to his language challenges, he was severely nearsighted. After action was called, he would often ride his horse into the battle scenes, forgetfully still wearing his glasses, necessitating even more takes. And while Lambert did have a language coach on set every day, an exhausting 6 weeks during post-production would be spent re-recording every line of MacLeod's dialogue. The movie's opening scene at Madison Square Garden was originally supposed to take place during an NHL hockey game, intercutting between a hockey brawl and the clash of immortals in the parking garage. But when the NHL learned of the filmmakers' intentions, they refused to be part of the shoot, because apparently they didn't want hockey to be associated with violence. Anyway, the sports conflict then instead became a professional wrestling match. Perhaps some of the biggest production challenges involved the limited availability and prickly personality of Sean Connery, who initially had such little faith in Mulcahy that he bet the director would not get everything filmed in 7 days. But Mulcahy's frenzied style was to shoot quickly with multiple cameras, and the director would ultimately win that bet, even filming some of Ramirez's reaction shots in advance. But it was not smooth sailing for that week. According to Mulcahy, Connery would tell the producers how bad he thought the production was going, and would point out crew members he felt weren't doing their job properly. But Mulcahy said that when Connery first looked at the dailies, he stopped doing it, so he must have been impressed with what he saw. Of course, one reason for Connery's mischievous behavior could have been that he was, allegedly, often drunk during filming, sipping from a flask of potent homemade scotch. One scene Connery was not too fond of was his fight with the Kurgan in the Forge, which also happened to be both Connery and Clancy Brown's first day of filming. Brown was meant to burst through the door and chop the table in half, but in his excitement, he missed his mark and struck the table wrong, breaking his sword and narrowly missing Connery's head with a flying shard of lethal metal. After nearly meeting the fate of his character, Connery was understandably agitated and stormed off the set. When he finally returned, Brown apologized profusely for his error, and Connery joked that maybe he should use his stunt double more often. Brown's savagery was also not a surprise to most of the cast and crew, who felt that the actor was getting so immersed in the role that he was becoming the Kurgan, and many were scared to even talk to him. Brown himself has since admitted in multiple interviews that he did not have a great time making the film. For starters, he had a different vision for the character, picturing the present-day incarnation as what he described as a cross between a shark and a Wall Street dude. He wanted the modern Kurgan to wear a suit and bowler hat to contrast his more monstrous past appearance, but he was ultimately forced into the film's punk biker look. The Kurgan also originally had another entire fight scene during the Gathering in New York, clashing with another immortal in a Wall Street office building. Unfortunately, after Brown performed all his own stunt work, the sequence was cut for time, and the footage was reportedly lost in a fire, with only still images remaining. Brown also did not have kind words for the movie's producers, who he later referred to as buzzards and scavengers. He was paid next to nothing for what is arguably his most iconic role, and he does not even receive any residuals as he was working under a BAFTA contract. Brown has said that the cast and crew were trying to make a good movie, but the producers only wanted to cut corners and do things on the cheap. One example was the first day of filming, when the producers had decided that extras would not be offered breakfast. The crew thought this was unacceptable and considered walking off the production. Only the threat of making the producers explain their decision to Sean Connery got them to relent, but tensions on set would continue until the shoot was finally finished after 5 months. While the movie was being edited, the search for a soundtrack started. One of the bands interested was legendary rockers Queen, who had originally agreed to record one song, but after viewing a cut of the film were inspired to write more. The members of the band had different favorite scenes and would each write their own songs until the entire film was virtually filled with Queen's music. But the movie's American distributor, Fox, did not have much interest in Highlander. Executives were reportedly confused by the time-jumping narrative and requested edits, and the studio was unsure how to even promote the unique concept, as particularly evidenced by the movie's ambiguous black-and-white poster of Connor's head. Of course, the fact that the producers had brought legal action against the studio over another project at the same time is also a possible contributing factor to the lack of advertising. When Highlander was released in North American theaters in March 1986, it was effectively dead on arrival. Although it was the weekend's only major new release, it landed in 7th place with just $2.4 million, not even enough to beat the 4th weekend of the Goldie Hawn football comedy Wildcats. The studio had refused to screen Highlander for critics, and by the time they did see it, many came with their blades drawn, calling the movie stylish but overblown, profoundly derivative, and unintentional farce. With an eventual worldwide box office total of $13 million on an estimated cost of $19 million, it seemed like Highlander would vanish into the past, never to be heard from again. But much like Connor MacLeod of the Clan MacLeod, Highlander simply would not die. Christopher Lambert's popularity in Europe helped spread the movie's reputation, and American audiences really discovered the movie on home video store shelves, quickly raising it to cult status and prompting the producers to continue the story with the nonsensical 1991 sequel Highlander 2: The Quickening, yet another expensive box office dud. While that loopy reunion of Mulcahy, Lambert, and Connery was richly deserving of its own what the fuck episode, it was still not enough to kill the Highlander franchise, and the immortal mythology would ultimately span a total of 5 features, 1 anime, 2 live-action TV series, and an animated show, with Christopher Lambert returning as Connor MacLeod multiple times. The original 1986 Highlander would also eventually get a director's cut on DVD, restoring scenes that Russell Mulcahy felt were vital to the story. Although it traveled a long and rough road, Highlander finally made its mark on pop culture, and it still might not be the end for this saga of immortals hacking heads through history. A reboot has been in the works for over a decade, with actors like Ryan Reynolds and Henry Cavill considering picking up the sword. But even with all the sequels and spin-offs and possible remakes, when it comes to Highlander, let's be honest.
There can be